The gateway chamber was a cacophony of sound and light. Technicians scurried between consoles, barking out readings as the air thrummed with an unnatural energy. The gateway itself dominated the room, its massive steel frame encasing a shimmering surface that seemed to ripple with every pulse of the machinery. To Evan Reid, it looked like a wound in the fabric of reality, a tear that refused to heal. His gear felt heavy against his trembling body. The tactical vest, oxygen pack, and communication equipment were supposed to make him feel prepared, but they only made the reality of his situation more suffocating. A scientist in a lab coat approached, his face pale and drawn. "Your mission is straightforward," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "The portal's instability is growing. We've pinpointed a node on the other side that should allow for recalibration. You'll plant the beacon and activate it. Once it stabilizes, we'll extract you." Evan's eyes flicked to the portal, its surface pulsing like a heartbeat. "And what happens if it doesn't stabilize?" The scientist hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor. "Let's not dwell on that." Colonel Vance's voice boomed from across the room. "Enough stalling. Reid, you're up. We need that node stabilized." Evan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to step forward. The technicians attached a harness to his vest, a lifeline that supposedly ensured his return. He wasn't sure if it was comforting or a grim reminder that he might need to be dragged back in pieces. As the countdown began, the hum of the portal grew louder, resonating in his chest. 5, 4, 3. Each second stretched into an eternity. 2, 1. The shimmering surface of the portal flared, and Evan stepped through. The transition was instantaneous and yet infinite. For a brief, agonizing moment, Evan felt his body dissolve, his molecules scattering like dust on the wind. There was no pain, only a deep primal sense of wrongness. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. He landed hard on his knees, the impact jarring him back to reality. The world around him was wrong. The sky was a swirling mass of dark purples and blacks, streaked with veins of glowing green light. It churned like a living thing, casting an eerie, pulsating glow over the landscape. The ground beneath him was soft and fleshy, a tangled mass of sinewy tendrils that pulsed faintly under his weight. A metallic tang filled the air, making his throat burn with each breath. Evan rose shakily, his boots sinking slightly into the ground. He looked around, his stomach twisting at the alien scenery. Towering spires of bone-like structures jutted from the ground, their surfaces glistening with a slick, black substance. In the distance, he could see massive, lumbering shapes, creatures with too many limbs and translucent, gelatinous bodies. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms flickering as though they weren't entirely solid. His radio crackled, and he jumped at the sound. "Reid, do you copy?" It was Vance's voice, distant and distorted. "I'm here," Evan replied, his voice shaking. I'm through." "Good. The node should be 1/2 kilometer from your position. We're tracking your signal." Evan glanced at the small device strapped to his wrist, its screen displaying a blinking dot marking the node's location. The thought of moving through this nightmarish terrain made his skin crawl, but he had no choice. He started walking, each step sinking slightly into the spongy ground. The tendrils beneath him seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive. The journey to the node was a waking nightmare. The landscape grew more twisted the farther he went, the spires bending and warping into grotesque shapes. Pools of viscous black liquid dotted the ground, their surfaces rippling as though something beneath them was stirring. Shadows flickered in the corner of his vision, but whenever he turned to look, there was nothing there. Halfway to the node, he stumbled upon the remains of a previous expedition. The sight stopped him cold. A tattered backpack lay partially buried in the ground, its contents scattered. Nearby, a helmet was lodged in one of the spires, its visor cracked and smeared with blood. But it was the body that made his stomach turn, or what was left of it. The figure was fused to the ground, its torso melded with the fleshy tendrils. The face was contorted in a rictus of agony, its features half dissolved. The arms were elongated, ending in jagged claws that looked more alien than human. A faint, wet, rasping sound came from its throat, and Evan realized with horror that it was still alive, or something close to it. He stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. The figure's eyes, or what remained of them, rolled toward him, and a gurgling moan escaped its lips. Evan turned and ran, his breath coming in panicked gasps. When he finally reached the node, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely activate the beacon. The node itself was a pulsating mass of alien machinery, its surface a chaotic blend of metal and organic matter. Evan placed the beacon on the node, its small lights blinking as it synced with the system. "Beacon placed," he said into his radio, his voice trembling. "Initiating calibration." The beacon emitted a high-pitched whine as it worked, the node responding with violent pulses of light. The ground beneath him quaked, and Evan braced himself against the tremors. The beacon's lights turned green, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope. Then the world around him erupted in chaos. A deafening roar echoed through the air, and Evan spun around to see a massive creature emerging from the horizon. It was easily 50 feet tall, its body a nightmarish amalgamation of flesh and translucent membranes. Dozens of spindly limbs jutted from its torso, each tipped with razor-sharp claws. Its head, or what he assumed was its head, was a mass of writhing tendrils, each ending in glowing yellow eyes. The creature's gaze locked onto him, and Evan felt a cold, primal terror grip him. The beacon's whine grew louder, its synchronization process nearing completion, but the creature was closing in fast. "Vance, I need extraction now!" Evan shouted into his radio, but the only response was static. The creature let out another roar, its tendrils whipping wildly as it charged. Evan's survival instincts kicked in, and he ran, the fleshy ground squelching beneath his boots. The beacon detonated behind him, sending a shock wave rippling through the air. The creature howled in pain, its body convulsing as the node collapsed in on itself. Evan didn't stop running. The portal loomed in the distance, its shimmering surface a beacon of salvation. As he neared it, he felt the ground shift beneath him, the tendrils writhing as though trying to pull him under. With a final burst of adrenaline, he dove into the portal, the creature's roar echoing in his ears as the world dissolved into blinding light. When Evan landed back in the gateway chamber, he was barely conscious. The technicians rushed to his side, their voices distant and distorted. His body ached, his skin burning where the alien atmosphere had touched it. "Reid, can you hear me?" Vance's voice cut through the haze. Evan nodded weakly, his mind reeling. He had survived, but he knew the nightmare was far from over. Something had followed him back. He could feel it, a faint hum resonating deep within his chest. The portal hadn't just taken him to another world, it had changed him. Evan awoke in darkness. The air was thick and warm, carrying the faint smell of decay. For a moment he thought he was back in the alien world, the nightmare stretching endlessly before him. But then he saw the faint glow of emergency lights and felt the cold steel beneath his hands. He was back at Area 51, or at least some part of it. His body ached in ways that felt unnatural. His skin was hot to the touch, and when he flexed his fingers, he swore he felt the sensation ripple beyond the physical confines of his body. He sat up, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The room spun, his vision flickering in and out. He felt wrong, like something inside him was moving. "Reid, you're awake." The voice came from the corner of the room. Evan turned sharply, his vision finally focusing. Dr. Lena Ortiz stood there, her face pale and drawn. She was clad in a tattered lab coat, dark circles under her eyes, and an expression that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Where am I?" Evan managed to croak. "The lower levels," Lena said softly, her voice hollow. "After you came back, they brought you here. They've been monitoring you." Evan's mind raced, fragments of memory snapping into place. The portal, the creature, the escape. Monitoring me. Why? Lena hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've been altered, Evan. We've all seen it. Whatever that place was, it left a mark on you." He looked down at his hands, trembling in his lap. At first glance, they appeared normal, but as he stared, faint veins of iridescent light shimmered beneath his skin, pulsing faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. He jerked back, his breath catching. "What the hell did they do to me?" His voice cracked, fear and anger battling for dominance. "It wasn't them," Lena said. "It's what came back with you. That place, those creatures, they're not just physical beings. They infect, they change, and they've been using us, using you to bring pieces of themselves here." Evan's stomach churned. He remembered the files, the experiments, the reports of returned test subjects warped beyond recognition. He was one of them now. A grotesque experiment, a conduit. Before Evan could respond, alarms blared, their shrill cry reverberating through the steel walls. Lena's eyes widened. "They know we're talking. We don't have much time." "Who knows?" Evan asked, forcing himself to stand despite the burning in his muscles. "The ones running this place, Vance, the directors, they've known all along. The Harbinger project wasn't about exploration or research. It was about exploitation. They're trying to harness the gateway's energy, to weaponize it. But they didn't care about the cost. They didn't care about us." Her words hit him like a blow. He'd suspected something, but to hear it confirmed was a different kind of horror. His life, his work, his sacrifices, they had all been for a lie. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice grim. "They're going to terminate you, Evan. You're a liability now, too unstable. But I think you already know that." He clenched his fists, the faint glow beneath his skin flaring briefly. "How do we stop this?" Lena hesitated, then pulled a small device from her pocket. It was a detonator, the kind used to trigger high-energy explosives. "There's only one way we destroy the portal, permanently." Evan's heart raced. Destroying the portal meant cutting off the creature's influence, but it also meant severing the base's most heavily guarded project. If they were caught, there would be no escape. How? He asked simply. Lena's eyes met his. The reactor powering the portal is unstable. We overload it and the whole thing goes up, but we have to get to the control room first. The base was chaos. As Evan and Lena moved through the labyrinthine corridors, the alarms grew louder, accompanied by the heavy tread of boots. Security teams were mobilizing, their radios crackling with orders. Evan could feel the pressure building inside him, a strange energy coursing through his veins. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner hiding unseen threats. They reached the control room without incident, but the sight inside made Evan freeze. Colonel Vance was there, flanked by armed guards. His expression was calm, almost smug. "I figured you'd try something like this," Vance said, his tone icy. "You're not the first to think you can outmaneuver us, but you are the first to be foolish enough to believe it." Evan stepped forward, his hands clenched. "You've been lying to us, to everyone. The portal isn't a tool, it's a doorway for them. You can't control it." "And yet we've learned so much," Vance said, his gaze narrowing. "The power we've harnessed, the advancements we've made, all thanks to sacrifices like yours. You're part of something greater, Reid. You should be proud." "Proud," Evan snarled. "You're playing with forces you don't understand. You're condemning us all." Vance shook his head. "Spare me the morality lecture. It's too late for that." Evan felt the heat rising inside him, the glow beneath his skin brightening. He glanced at Lena, who nodded subtly. They had no time for arguments. With a roar, Evan lunged at the guards. The energy inside him erupted, and a shockwave of light and force sent them sprawling. His body felt like it was tearing apart, but he pushed through the pain. Lena sprinted to the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. "What are you doing?" Vance shouted, regaining his footing. "Ending this," Lena said without looking up. Evan held his ground as more guards poured into the room. He fought them off with a strength that didn't feel like his own, his movements fueled by something alien. The glow beneath his skin spread, illuminating the room in a sickly pulsating light. "Lena, hurry!" he shouted, his voice distorted. "Almost there," she replied. The reactor's hum grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that shook the walls. Alarms blared again, this time accompanied by a robotic voice. "Warning, reactor overload. Evacuate immediately." Vance's face twisted in rage. "You fools! You'll kill us all!" "That's the idea," Evan said, his voice cold. Lena finished her work and ran to Evan's side. "It's done. We have to go." The two of them sprinted through the corridors as the base descended into chaos. The walls trembled, lights flickering wildly. Behind them, the reactor's core emitted a blinding light, its energy spiraling out of control. They reached the surface just as the explosion tore through the base. A deafening roar filled the air, and the ground buckled beneath them. Evan and Lena were thrown to the ground, shielding their faces as the shock wave rolled over them. When the dust settled, the base was gone. A massive crater remained, its edges glowing faintly with residual heat. The portal was destroyed, its connection severed, but Evan knew the cost had been high. In the aftermath, Evan and Lena stood at the edge of the crater, the silence heavy between them. "It's over," Lena said softly. Evan looked down at his hands. The glow was fainter now, but it was still there. The creature's influence hadn't left him. He was a living reminder of what had happened and what could still come. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." Lena turned to him, her expression uncertain. What do you mean? Evan met her gaze, his eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. We stopped the portal, but they're still out there, and they won't stop until they find another way in. He turned and began walking into the desert, his silhouette illuminated by the faint, alien light beneath his skin. Lena watched him go, her heart heavy. She knew she would never see him again. And deep down, she feared he was right.